Good afternoon. This is just a presentation on Fiji's political history, especially on the identification of a national identity. So, to start off, we will go back in history, going to pre-European history, that is basically before the arrivals of Europeans. Fiji was divided up into chiefdoms, basically areas around Fiji, especially the two main islands, but only when Wittilio were parcel out into these fiefdoms that were governed by these tribal chiefs. And people in Fiji identify themselves not as a national coherent identity, but they identify themselves as which tribes or clans that they belong to. And at this time as well, before the arrival of Europeans, there were frequent tribal wars fought between the different tribes and clans that make up the Fijian Islands. Then we have the arrivals of the explorers, the whalers, and the Bitsdima traders and the sandalwood traders. Once these people arrived, they traded with the local communities, the local native communities, in terms of extracting those natural resources that they want in exchange for European items, such as the muskets, knives, which was in demand by the tribal chiefs. The tribal chiefs, in exchange for those European items, they sold off lands, which in some cases did not belong to them. This created land issues later on, but we will touch on that on a different video. But for this, we just the discussion on the development of national identity. Once the arrival of the Europeans, especially the early traders, the whalers, and the Spitsdima and sandalwood traders, the tribal wars became more bloodier because of the use of these European arms, such as muskets and pistols. And this created a fractious relationship between the native tribes, and which led to the development of more powerful confederations, and such as the Baun chiefdoms, the Konrovi chiefdoms, and the Nandronga chiefdoms in the west. Then, due to the threat of the Tongan threat, Ratu Serta using coercions and threats, and which might say also the influences of Mbau women in the chiefly households around Fiji, managed to convince 13 other major chiefs around Fiji to cede their lands to the British Crown, which ultimately led to the deed of cession, which was signed in Levuka on 1874, 10th October 1874. But even at that time, during that occasion, people in Fiji still did not identify themselves as in a context of a national identity. They still view themselves in terms of which tribe they belong to, which religion they belong to, and so on, or which ethnic group they belong to. During the colonial period, especially with the implementation of the divide and rule policy by the by the British colonists, which led to the development of the native administration, which I might argue, which subjugated Itoke to their lands in perpetual subsistence living, which they became a passive bystander of economic development, which in their role in this structure which was developed by the British, which they used Ratsukuna as a strong advocate for the Itoke to be just to lease out their land without any involvement in the economic development of our country. And this sets the atmosphere for the later political upheavals we will later see after political independence in 1970, especially in the years 1977, 1987, 2000, and 2006. But during this time, while they took after the arrival of the Indo-Fijians after in the deed of cession, they arrived. The first arrival was in 1879. Then later, by 1920, there were more than 60,000 Indo-Fijians who came through the indentured labor scheme from India, and this created added another mix to how national identity was identified during that time. So now the ethnic tension, ethnic identity, or identity politics came into the mix for how national identity was constructed. Now people start to identify themselves in terms of what ethnic identity they belong to instead of looking at themselves as belonging to this country. This continued from this was established, I might argue, established and promoted during the time of the British colonial period. So because the British at that time were few in number, but in order to control and govern this country, they need to implement a policy where they need to divide and separate the ethnic groups from uniting or putting a united front against the economic and political policies of the British colonists, I might say, also discriminated against non-white European groups in terms of number of seats that are allocated to the different ethnic groups in the legislative assembly during the colonial period, which was always in favor of white European members of our country in Fiji. So this carried on, and even after 1970 independence, the legacy of the policy during the colonial period influenced how people identify themselves in terms of national identity. Ethno-nationalism became a norm, especially in the Itaukei ranks after 1970. There's still this idea that Indo-Fijians or Indians were seen as a threat in terms of alienation of their land, of the Itaukei land, despite constitutional guarantees, constitutional and legal guarantees which making those alienation of the land not impossible but very hard to do in terms of changing the laws to alienate Itaukei land. But despite that, there was still push by certain politicians such as the likes of Butanroka, especially in those nationalist ranks in the Itaukei political scene, that the Itaukei were under the threat of losing their land, losing political power, which ultimately will lead to the loss of their status as citizens of this country. And this created an atmosphere where people tend to segregate themselves into groups, especially into the ethnic mix, into ethnic labels. And this was a major component of elections in 1977. I might say was the first coup which was staged in terms of political coup, which was the then Governor General with the losing prime minister, they came up with a plan to bring back the losing party into power. Due to the party that won the election in 1977 did not set up a government. So they used that excuse, which I might say was just to promote ethno-nationalism. And at this time, people still identify themselves into the ethnic groups. There was no even this ethno-nationalistic idea was enshrined into our legal statutes and constitution at that time. From 1970 till now, Fiji had 4 constitutions. For a short independence period and for a small country like ours, we have 4 constitutions. The first 3 constitutions had these ethnic differences enshrined. And even from 1970 till 2006, we still had differences in how people perceive national identity. And even this was seen in our laws and ultimately in the supreme law of the land, the constitution. This all changed after Bainimarama came into power in 2006. He, on the premises, in fact, he staged a coup, military coup. But this military coup was different from the previous coups. The previous coups in 1977, 1987, and 2000 were ethno-nationalistic, which was focused primarily on promoting Itaukei interests. And which tend to alienate other ethnic groups. But in 2006, Bainimarama staged a military coup. One of the reasons was to promote a single national identity apart from fighting corruption, which I might say was very successful because once Bainimarama came to power, one of our huge corruption scam case was brought to light, which was the agriculture scam, where more than 18 million US dollars was scammed out of the government coffers, the government finances in 2001 and 2000. After nearly 10 years, that corruption activities was finally brought to light and those people involved were prosecuted. This was just to digress from the topic of national identity. So one of the two main reasons why Bainimarama staged a coup in 2006 was to fight corruption and also to promote a single national identity. And this ultimately was enshrined into our supreme law of the land in 2018 Fijian constitution. You might say our current constitution was dictatorial implemented, in the sense there was no public consultation. Yes, because the first version, which was done by Heshgai and his committee, after they went through the whole of Fiji, the major submissions that were done were primarily done by people who had negative viewpoints on how Fiji should be going forward. They mainly were ethno-nationalists who presented their points, people who did not see the larger picture. They did not realize, even those Itaukei, they have to realize what was stated in the census in 2007, 2017, 1997, that the Itaukei in the next 10 to 15 years would be in absolute majority. The reason is that the Itaukei had more children per household than the other ethnic groups. And also the other ethnic groups are not only having less children, but they are also migrating out of the country. So if we do not establish a single national identity, a problem of ethnic civil war in terms of there will be civil war or tension between the Itauke among themselves. And we will go back to the olden days where tribes will be fighting against tribes. And people do not realize that part. That's why the 2018 Constitution tried to remove those identity politics. And I believe the 2018 Constitution was a huge step in the right direction, despite how it was formulated. The goal and the idea, the aim behind this supreme law of the land, the current Constitution, had the right motive in trying to build a single national identity where all people who call themselves citizens of this country are known as Fijians, irrespective of racial or ethnic creed they belong to, religious affiliations or political viewpoints. If you are a citizen and you are subscribed to certain ideals and principles of this country, you are known as Fijians. And I believe in the last 8 years of the previous government, the Fiji First Party government, they promoted that, not only in how they conduct government business, but they also enshrine it in government policies, ultimately in our laws and constitution, which was also seen in how the language that was promoted, especially in parliament. There are different ethnic groups in Fiji. One important thing we have to consider is how people communicate across to one another, across ethnic groups, across religious groups. And as these ethnic groups and religious groups have their own languages, the Fiji First Party government promoted English as a language of communication, in which I believe all ethnic groups in Fiji, most I believe, have that as their second language apart from their mother tongue. And I believe some of these policies were being reversed, are being pulled back by recent actions after the 2022 general election, which I believe is taking us back. We have taken 10 steps forward with the 2018 Constitution, but with recent action, recent activities, recent decision, which I believe is taking us in the wrong direction, especially in this new government. Thank you. That's just a discussion on the national identity, especially in terms of Fiji's political history. Those are just some of my references, which are taken from several books, such as Fukama. There will be more presentation on discussion on how we can promote national identity, and it was implemented by the Fiji First Party government.